Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading It's a Jungle Out There by Ron Snell, and I'm beginning with chapter 13, which is kind of a continuation of chapter 12. Chapter 12 told a little bit about how the boys, Terry and Ron, wanted to go on a raft down the river, and their dad was preparing one for them, called Riding the Flood. When Dad had told us we could go on the raft trip, he knew the river would be high, but he didn't reckon on the Urumba being at its peak. Heavy rains Monday afternoon brought logs and debris swirling past on foaming brown currents. The awesome power of so much rushing water gave me chills. Fortunately, now that the plane had left to take Mom and Melody back to Yaranacacha, it was too late for Dad to change his mind. This was going to be a great ride. Early Tuesday, we heard Dad's familiar wake-up call, meant only for us, but loud enough to rouse everyone in the village. Not that any Machiguengas would be asleep after 5 a.m. "Ronnie, get up! Terry, get up!" he shouted. "I've got some fried eggs and oatmeal for you. Let's get it down and get going." As quickly as we could, we wolfed down big servings, grabbed our little bags of essentials, and canoed down to the mouth of the Camisea in the damp fog. The Machiguengas had already loaded their baggage and animals on the raft and were eager to get started. We huddled on the muddy bank for prayer. Then Arturo untied the thick vine that held the raft to a tree stump, and we were off to our fates. Within seconds, we floated out of the Camisea mouth and into the much bigger Urubamba River. Whirlpools, undertows, backwaters span and jolted us. Uprooted trees, unmanned, banged into us. 4 men manned the oars, working to keep us pointed with the current. In dangerous spots, the goal was always to have the logs going parallel with the current rather than sideways. Of course, in dangerous spots, we usually didn't have much influence on how the logs were pointed, and we just hung on for dear life. Our raft was about 30 feet long and 12 feet wide, made of 12 big balsa logs that were pointed on the ends. Hardwood poles were pinned across the logs to hold them together, and for good measure, everything was lashed with vines and the strong inner bark of the balsa trees. About 16 feet above the logs was a Pona floor that covered the middle 2/3 of the raft. Over the floored section, we had a low thatched roof to protect us from torrential rainstorms and merciless sun. The roof came right down to the floor, so we didn't need walls. All in all, it was a cozy home for the 9 of us, and I'm going to show you a picture of it again. And you can see how the roof comes all the way down in that one side view. Okay. The only way to control the raft was with 2 huge oars fashioned to Y sticks braced on each side of the front. The paddles on the ends of the sticks were 2 feet circles and stuck out like ears. If we wanted to do some serious paddling, it took 2 men on each paddle. We didn't really have that much control over the raft, even with the oars. It weighed a couple tons and pretty much went wherever the current dragged it. Still, a little control was better than none. We had all the comforts of home. There was plenty of water for bathing and drinking, though it was dirty brown, and there were lots of things floating in it besides us. Our toilet was the poop deck at the back of the raft. It flushed automatically, if you know what I mean. There was a coop by the poop filled with squawking, crowing, flapping, clucking chickens and ducks that didn't want to be there. 2 parrots with their wings clipped sat on the roof, rocked our passage. Stashed on the floor were woven baskets of coffee beans and barrels of corn to sell downriver, plus cooking pots, manioc, stalks of bananas, bedding and clothes. If we were lucky, all of this would stay on the raft and keep dry. No one is ever that lucky. Since it would be impossible to paddle our raft to shore every time we needed something or to chase animals in it, We towed a dugout canoe alongside. We could use it for errands, or we could all climb aboard and abandon the raft in an emergency. Never mind that the canoe tipped over easier than the raft, and that it already had 3 steel barrels of corn in it. These first few hours were an adrenaline rush. Never had we gone so fast on the Urubamba without a motor. "How do you like it?" Dad asked. He was excited as we were. "This is neat," I exclaimed. "I could do this for the rest of my life." Terry and I were bouncing back and forth between the front and back, making general nuisances of ourselves as we all raced along between towering trees. All of the familiar gravel bars were underwater, and we flew right over the tops of them. When we went through rapids, the high waves splashed up through the logs and sloshed against our legs. Late in the morning, we headed into a particularly wavy rapid. Water swirled around us, waves washed over the raft, and the current spun us around, dangerously close to the bank. The combination of waves and cross currents swamped the canoe, which overturned, dumping the 3 barrels of corn and banged into the raft. "Cut the canoe loose!" Arturo yelled at McGarry. McGarry was just a boy like me and even more afraid than I was. He wasn't about to let go of his handhold. While he hesitated, and before anyone could cut the rope holding the canoe to the raft, it swung around like a battering ram and banged into the chicken coops, setting ducks and chickens free. Now we had ducks, chickens, and 3 barrels of corn, all trying to get away, and our chase canoe was full of water. The ducks were delighted. The chickens were mad as wet hens. As soon as we had survived the rapid, we sloshed the water out of the canoe, and 2 Machiguengas took off after the ducks and corn. The chickens, of course, had nowhere to go, so catching them was a pretty fun game of crawling under the floor, up on the roof, and round the raft. "Here he comes, grab him when he's coming from under the floor," or "She's out on the oar, swim out there and grab her." Flapping feathers exploded around us, but sooner or later we got them all. The ducks, on the other hand, had a pretty clear advantage over the canoe. 3 of them made a complete getaway, ducking underwater with big smiles on their beaks whenever the canoe got close, and popping back up to the surface far beyond our reach. And we only got 2 of the 3 barrels of corn back. A terrible $4 loss. Did you see McGarry? He was as scared as a woman. He just sat there holding on like a sick little old man. Now that the crisis had passed, it was time to laugh and make jokes about the whole thing and to think about how hungry we were. "What have we got for lunch?" Terry asked. Chasing chickens had worked up our appetites. "Lunch? We don't have any lunch," Dad answered, as if we should have known that you don't eat lunch on a raft. "Have a couple of bananas to hold you over until supper." We were glad for our big breakfast, but it did seem like quite a while since we'd eaten. We had planned on passing the mouth of the Picho River the next day, but with our hyperspeed, we closed in on it about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That section of river included the famous Carpintero Rapids, where water churned over boulders that sat in the middle of the river. On the left side was a ragged cliff of red shale, constantly being eroded by the tons of water that crashed into it hour after hour. I had heard of the Carpintero ever since I could remember. Bad in low water, it could be worse now. The whole river was boiling like hot chocolate. Up ahead, we saw high waves tossing foam and debris into the air. Most of the river funneled directly into a huge rock. And wherever most of the river went, most of us were likely to follow. It would have been a perfect place to get into the canoe and paddle our way out of trouble, but we were caught off guard. The 4 men at the paddles laughed and joked, a really bad sign. When Machi men get slap happy, you can assume they think they have just minutes left to live. Their muscles bulged as they strained to pull us out of the main current. Put yourself into it, harder now. We're going to hit that rock and die. Ha 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 ha. Stronger, you weakling. You're pulling like a little girl. Louder laughter and falsetto. Aye! At the last minute, they gave up and grabbed onto anything they could. We remained very much in the main current. With a roar and a splash, we went under. Water covered the logs, soaked the floor. 200 yards of wide-eyed, white-knuckled anticipation, then a loud, splintering crash as we hit the rock. The left paddle snapped off like a twig, and the raft lurched, then crunched along the cliff, still mostly in one piece. The baptized chickens weren't pleased. The parrots on top, unaware of how close they'd come to being fish food, squawked happily in the wind and said Machiguengas words that I can't repeat. I suspect they were not nice words. With only one oar, all we could do was spin the raft around in circles, completely at the river's mercy. It was clearly a time for desperate measures. The Machis were talking fast. Suddenly, with a death-defying leap, Arturo sailed for the bank, holding the heavy vine tied to the front of the raft. He landed in the water, deep water, scrambled through the mud, whipped the vine around the nearest tree like a saddle horn, and hung on with all his might as he waited to see if the vine would hold and stop the raft. No bull wrestler could have done it better, especially in a river. We hit the end of the vine with a jerk that nearly pulled it out of Arturo's hands, but the tree, the vine, and the piece of raft it was tied to all held. With a bump, the raft banged into the bank and stopped. Within seconds, we were safely tethered and scrambled out to assess the damages. The only significant loss was a broken paddle. Although we'd have to replace it, at least we didn't have to fix the whole raft. Unfortunately, our toolkit didn't include an axe to chop down a tree. Go back to the mission and get an axe, Arturo suggested. We'll all get started while we're waiting. 3 of the Indians walked back through the jungle to the mouth of the Picha, where the same priest who had helped Dad and Arturo after Dionisio's accident loaned them his axe. In the meantime, the remaining Machiguengas started to work with machetes, while Terry and I made little streams in the sand. Within 3 hours, the amazing Indians had chopped down a tree, cut out a section of it, and split the section into boards. While someone returned the axe to the mission, those who stayed behind used their machetes to cut the boards into rough circles with stems to tie them onto their long shafts. Just to be on the safe side, they made 2 new paddles so we'd have spares. By 5, we were more or less back in business. So we floated for another half hour before tying up at a semi-protected section of sandbar for the night. Close by were some Machiguengas gardens where we could find fruit and manioc. Mario and I made a fire. Terry and the others collected firewood and food. By dark, we were eating a fabulous supper of roasted fish, boiled, cooking bananas, coffee, and taffy. Dad wasn't quite as impressed with it as we were. I kind of prefer steak and potatoes with all the trimmings, he said, as we raved over the fish. We were glad our taste buds hadn't been ruined by life outside the jungle. That night, Dad and Terry and I slept on the raft in luxury, listening to the waves slap the balsa logs. The Indians preferred to sleep on the beach. They lay beside the fire on big, soft balsa leaves, secure in the knowledge that the sandbar wouldn't come untied and drift off at night. The raft, on the other hand, might. Ringing machetes woke us up at 5 a.m. The Indians were already boiling bananas and manioc for breakfast while someone refined the new paddles. At 5:30, fed and loaded, we floated off into the mist. Before we even saw it, we heard it. The raging roar of another bad spot. It was nearly the reverse of the Carpintero, with all of the river charged full blast into that right-hand bank. Water mounded up against the bank and then swirled off into whirlpools and undertows. This looked even worse than the Carpintero, and we had to buy some time. Getting the raft stopped would be nearly impossible, since it was picking up speed as we headed downhill. This is just too dangerous. We've got to get tied up to the bank. Grab the vine. We can't stop the raft. It's going too fast. If we don't stop it, we'll all die. Machiguengas lived with death all around them and talked about it a lot more casually than we liked. Too fast or not, several of them jumped off the raft, held fast until the raft swung to a stop beside the bank. Get in the canoe with McGeary and Andres, Arturo instructed us. They can paddle you past the worst spots. We'll take the raft through and meet you downriver. Oh, do we have to? I pled with Dad. We didn't want to miss any of the action. Yeah, we need to do what they tell us on this one. They're afraid the undertow is going to pull the raft into the worst spot, and they want it to be as light as possible. Besides, they don't want to be responsible for us while they're trying to get the raft through. We would just be in the way. We climbed in the canoe to watch. Once set free, the raft quickly gained speed. 4 men pumped at the oars, hoping to outwit the treacherous undertow and miss the worst of it. Do you think they'll make it, Dad? To me, it didn't look likely. The raft was barely responding to all the hard work. I could just picture the raft shattering on impact, dumping all its passengers into the swirling water and leaving us all stranded. Oh yeah, they know what they're doing. Dad had a lot of confidence in the Machiguengas, but he didn't sound as sure as he might have. Just a month before, he had watched one drown. From our front row seats, we could see the whole show. The men heaved on the oars. The raft rose and fell on the banking waves, heading full speed for the high bank. In seconds, it would be over. Yeah, I wasn't breathing. A few feet were all it took to clear the bank. The raft leaned precariously against the mound of water and went under for its second baptism, but rushed uncrunched away from the cliff, both oars still intact. We inhaled and cheered and paddled off to catch up. Later in the day, we picked up some Peru Indians who were hitchhiking on a sandbar. They wanted a lift to Bufio Pozo, they said, but got off sooner at the Peru Bible School. The Perus already had quite a lot of the Bible translated into their language. And if you'll recall, that's why they are in the jungle, is the parents are translators, and they're learning the Machiguenga language. That night, we stayed with the German missionaries who ran the Bible school. They fed us venison and boiled manioc and invited us to sleep on the dirt floor of their schoolhouse. The Machiguengas opted for the raft, which was tied in a rather swift spot. If we lost the raft during the night, at least they would be aboard. Our third morning started at 4:45. As we cruised along at mid-morning, one of the ducks escaped from the coop. Quick as a wink, Andres jumped into the canoe and went after it, paddling with a hand grab. Just as he shot out his hand, the duck ducked, and we all burst out laughing. Startled and embarrassed, Andreas laughed harder than all of us. The race was on. The duck surfaced just upriver from us and hurtled past the raft, flapping and paddling like a water wheel. Andreas was right behind it in the canoe, and as the canoe tore past the raft, Mario jumped in. They closed in on the duck, and Mario reached to grab it. Too late! Oh, the duck went down, and we all roared, waiting to see where it would come up next. Since it stayed close to the raft, everyone joined in, grabbing sticks to try and hit it when it came up. After 10 minutes of fun, someone hit the breathless thing too hard and injured its leg. It gave up and started drowning. Andreas and Mario closed in and grabbed it before it disappeared and threw it back into the coop. A couple hours after the duck chase, we approached Sepa, an isolated jungle prison colony for murderers and dangerous political prisoners. We had to check in with the police there, but it took forever to get to shore. A long series of whirlpools took us in big circles, down, up, around, and back down the river. For an hour, we were within sight of the town, but going nowhere. When we finally pulled into shore, we went directly to see the new director of the colony. At the time, we never imagined that in a year, Terry and I would help chase down 4 of his escaped murderers. But that's another story. We explained who we were and then sold him one of the parrots, a bag of coffee beans, and several of the chickens and ducks. To celebrate our lightened load and successful sale, the Machis plucked the injured duck, laughing and enjoying its pain. They love to torture animals, so they often plucked chickens and ducks before killing them. I tried not to look or listen, but it was kind of hard in such close quarters. When they were through, it made great soup. By the time we settled in for our 3rd night, we could see flashes of lightning upriver and hear pounding thunder in the distance. The Machiguengas villages were getting another good soaking. That would mean an even higher river soon. Once again, the Indians slept on the beach. Dad and Terry and I got the floor of the raft to ourselves and were soundly sleeping when the river rose so high it pulled the raft loose. Fortunately, the Indians seldom all slept at the same time, especially since they were keeping a wary eye on the water level. "Father, the raft is loose," someone called out around midnight. Dad was father to most of their teachers on this trip. I'm not sure what they expected him to do about it. We bolted awake in time to see dark shapes jumping aboard as the raft slowly pulled away from the flooding beach. The water had already risen a couple of feet and had not crested yet. Heavy black clouds covered the night sky. It was so dark that we couldn't tell where the river ended and the trees began, nor where the trees ended and the sky began. It was hard to see each other, much less obstacles in the river. For the first and only time the whole trip, even Dad was afraid. The roaring of rapids filled our ears, but it was impossible to tell which way to go through them. Our puny flashlights probed the night, but only warned us of what was coming. By the time we could see anything, there was no way to avoid it. We banged into the bank and trees. We bobbed up and down on the waves and felt water sloshing around us and our stuff. Every once in a while, we sped past the light of a campfire on shore, then back into total darkness. No one slept, in case we suddenly had to swim for our lives. Our flashlights grew dimmer as the batteries wore down. By the time we could distinguish between trees and sky and river, we were all exhausted from the strain. But we were alive and still afloat. There would be plenty of time later for naps, piled one on top of the other. That night was our last one tied up the shore. Once the Urubamba and the Tambo rivers joined to make Ucayali River, the rapids petered out and we could drift 24 hours a day. The Ucayali was wide and full of drifting trees. Those trees, in fact, gave us some great fun. "Hey, let's go climb on that one," I suggested, pointing to a particularly big one. Terry wasn't interested, but McGeary and I paddled the canoe over to the massive trunk that floated 50 yards away. We climbed aboard and explored the branches and roots, all still intact. In fact, it's the only time I've ever climbed a tree floating down a river. That was more fun than a wild pig stampede. Let's build a fire and roast some bananas, McGeary. I was thinking about moving in permanently. We broke off some of the twigs, pulled some matches out of a pocket, and got a pretty good blaze going on a dry spot. It was sort of like sawing off the branch you're sitting on. But this log could burn for a long, long time before we sank it. McGeary went back to the raft for bananas, and we had a mighty fine lunch just coasting down the river on our private treehouse. Things turned routine for the last 3 days. We pretty much stayed on the raft because the river was so high we seldom saw any land to get out on. Once in a while, we'd paddle the canoe into a town and stock up on basic supplies like candy and sugar, then hurry to catch up with the raft again. Terry and I took turns at the oars, not doing anything significant, but still feeling as if we were helping somehow. The farther downriver we got, the more pink river dolphins we saw. They played around the raft, sometimes 4 or 5 of them jumping and blowing in a row. Along with more dolphins, there was more river traffic. We often waved at dugouts, motor launches, and other rafts that shared our flowing highway. We arrived at Pucallpa, tired and wet after dark on Christmas Day, 7 days after leaving Camisea. Since no one was expecting us, we spent the night swatting mosquitoes on the raft. Mary and Joseph in a liquid Bethlehem. In the morning, we shocked everyone by showing up at Yaranacacha in the back of a chartered truck. Since the trip normally took 10 to 15 days, our 7-day race must have set some kind of a record. Sadly, this adventure had a bit of an unhappy ending because we'd had so much fun, and because all the kids at Yaranacacha were jealous, our teachers made us write down the story of our trip. That's how I know that everything you've just read is true. Even though it's not exactly how my dad remembers it, my mom has repressed the whole thing. That was a very entertaining chapter. The next one's called The Posse. And we had a hint, I think, in this chapter of what was going to happen, because it looks like it's lawmen and possibly going out to hunt for somebody. Anyway, we'll find out when we read it. Bye-bye.